I want to give a special thank you to New St. Andrews College for assisting us in putting on this event and providing a great speaker as well. I want to start off with a few thoughts about why we're doing this event before we begin. So we started the Theology of American Statecraft series because we saw that it filled a critical need in the political sphere in Washington, D.C. The Christian policymaking influence in this town has trended extremely woke since the election of President Donald Trump in 2016. As I'm sure many of you remember, and I'm sure as the senator remembers, they spent all of COVID-19 telling you that you needed to wear your mask to love your neighbor. They say that calling someone by their preferred pronouns is respectful, and they even advocate for reducing civil liberties like free speech and our Second Amendment rights. But the rot in our Protestant institutions goes deeper than that. It was not long ago that Protestants and evangelicals in this country were the most supportive demographic group of the disastrous war in Iraq. Many of the prominent intellectuals that we recognized as wolves in sheep's clothing in 2020, i.e., I'm talking about David French, were wreaking havoc back in 2003. Christians all over America have lost the first principles that their forefathers believed in and expounded voluminously upon. What does God say about property rights? What does he say about men and women? And yes, what does he say about when a war is waged righteously? It is our hope at American Moment that this event will be an enlightening entree to many of the young policymakers in this room and across Washington, D.C. about what God has to say about war and when it is to be fought. So thank all of you for being here, and let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, a great American patriot, a very good friend of American Moment, the senator from the great state of Wisconsin. Please give it up for Senator Ron Johnson.
Well, thank you, Nick, and thank all of you for coming here. Thanks for American Moment for sponsoring this. Actually made my job pretty easy. They structured in my briefing 3 questions they wanted me to answer, and so I'll just actually try and answer those questions. First one really is a federally elected official, what are my thoughts on war and diplomacy? And I mean, I really go back to our founding fathers and the fact that they warned us about foreign entanglements. I think we need to heed that type of warning. I think we did that pretty well up until we were dragged into, I suppose, First World War, but in particularly the Second World War, and we were attacked. We had to respond. We obviously had to liberate Europe, and we emerged from World War II as a world superpower. And I think an awful lot of Americans, I would say, is reluctant world superpower. So you had to start asking yourself the question, well, what should our role in the world be? Now, I've never felt that America should be the world policeman. But because we are the world superpower, where we have the capability to provide stability, where it's in our national interest to do so, I think that ought to be the focus and the overall goal of our foreign policy. For example, freedom of navigation. We maintain a Navy, hopefully not to project our offensive power, but to defensively protect freedom of navigation that has allowed the world to engage in trade and accomplish tremendous things over the last few decades. I mean, that's a worthy goal, and right now it's being threatened. China is certainly threatening it by militarizing the South China Seas. We see the Houthis attacking Western shipping. That's another story, and we'll kind of get into that. But again, my primary thought is a limited role, recognizing that we are the world superpower, that we can provide stability, and it's in our national interest to do so. I think the other thought when it comes to war and diplomacy is recognizing what Ronald Reagan taught us very succinctly, that you achieve peace through strength. I'm not quite sure how he meant that. The way I interpret that, though, is not necessarily military strength. To me, that is the last component of that. It starts with national strength, which starts with national unity. If you would have asked me a couple of years ago, what is the greatest threat to our nation, I would have really parroted what Admiral Mike Mullen talked about as our debt and deficit. That's why I ran in 2010. We were mortgaging our children's future. We are exacerbating that problem right now. I mean, we haven't fixed it at all. We're making it far worse. But having said that, right now I would say that is not the greatest threat to our nation. I think it's the fact that we are horribly divided. And it was Lincoln, quoting Scripture, said that a house divided against itself cannot stand. It's true. I guess I often warn people I'm not the most uplifting character because I have this compulsion to tell the truth, and right now the reality is not good. But if there's anything positive I can say, there's no reason for us to be divided this way. Not nationally, not internationally. I mean, if you think about it, in terms of human condition, what are the major goals that we as human beings share? They're universal. We want safety. We want security. We want peace. We want enough opportunity to provide for ourselves and our family, maybe for a secure retirement. Okay, those are universal goals. So why are we so horribly divided? Well, internationally, you've just got evil leaders. Let's be honest. It's not, we don't have a problem with Russian people, Chinese. We have a problem with evil leadership. But you look at it nationally, you understand that we are a naturally united country. You take a look at what happens after 9/11. Like that, we're united. So why are we so divided? Again, in terms of national politics, we have leaders, we have political groups that are purposefully dividing us. That's what identity politics is about. That's what critical race theory is about. That's this whole issue about transgenderism. Listen, America, we're the good guys. We're a compassionate people. If those that suffer from gender dysphoria, we have compassion for. Don't have a whole lot of patience or compassion for the radical left that are pushing transgenderism on our children. So anyway, veering a little bit off the subject from a standpoint of foreign policy, but that is what concerns me, is we are a divided nation, and that's the first step of a strong nation. You have to be united. You can't be divided. Then it becomes economic strength. A free market economy. I mean, we are a marvel of the world, historically. But we're ruining that as well. With an open border, with 40-year high inflation, with massive deficit spending, we are weakening ourselves. Just about everything. I've said this repeatedly. If you were asked to devise a strategy to destroy this nation, you'd be hard-pressed. You couldn't. You couldn't come up with a better game plan than what Biden and his Democrat allies in Congress are implementing. The open borders, 40-year high inflation, massive deficit spending, the war on fossil fuels, the embarrassing and dangerous surrender in Afghanistan. Now, I'd like to talk about Afghanistan. I'm not a supporter of the fact that we sent Tommy Frank over there, but he was there. And we spent trillions of dollars and thousands of lives lost and thousands of casualties. You don't just bug out of the region. That emboldened our enemies. But all of these actions of the Biden administration have weakened America. And when America is weak, our adversaries notice it. They take advantage of it, and the world becomes a more dangerous place. That's why the world's in flames, because America has been weakened by Democrat governance. Okay, so that's first question. Probably spent too much time on it. Have my feelings evolved? They absolutely have. Because I have more experience now. I've seen more things. My eyes have been opened up. I know how I was played as chairman and ranking member of the European Subcommittee, for example, on Ukraine. Played by the State Department. But let me back up to a moment in time that I'll move away from. 1991, I've got my foreign policy guy here, printed me out the readout between a meeting between Gorbachev and James Baker. I think it was in Berlin or Munich, whatever. It was following Glasnost and Perestroika, okay, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. And if you read that, you'll be struck by how unbelievably cooperative and concerned they were about what America had to do to stay involved, troops in Europe, how they should be stationed part of NATO in East Berlin. unbelievably cooperative. And you have to ask yourself the question, what happened? And that's what we need to do from a standpoint of all of our foreign entanglements and our foreign policy and our defense posture, is we need to be retrospective. We need to take a look at history and ask the question, well, what happened with our involvement in Vietnam? 58,000 Americans lost. What happened in Afghanistan? What happened in Iraq? What's happened in Ukraine? If we take a look at that honestly, again, not that we don't have good intentions, not that Americans aren't good, but I think our policymakers have made grievous mistakes and errors. Again, the best book I read on Afghanistan was written by a couple folks in Special Operations Forces who made a very convincing case that we'd pretty well accomplished what we needed to accomplish following the attack on 9/11. We achieved retribution. Now, we didn't get Osama bin Laden, but we should have done what we did, and we should have gone home. We should have learned from history that Afghanistan is pretty much an unconquerable land. But we stayed there, spent trillions of dollars, again, the death, the casualties, and look at where we are today. The Taliban are back there. Terrorist organizations are back there. All that, quite honestly, for naught. Look at Iraq. Pretty much controlled by Iran now. But I want to spend a little bit of time on Ukraine, because that I have firsthand knowledge. I first went to Ukraine in 2011. This is when Timoshenko, I think, had been jailed, and you're seeing the corruption of that political system. They're talking about the media oligarchs. When I heard that, by the way, the first thing I thought, well, we have media oligarchs. We just call them media billionaires. But the same control, which is, by the way, is the big threat to our democracy, is we do not have an unbiased media. We have a highly biased media, primarily infiltrated by the radical left. They are not holding both sides equally accountable. But went there in 2011, they're concerned about corruption in the wheat markets. Fast forward, I joined the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in 2013. I was the ranking member of the European Subcommittee, so you start looking at these issues. And I remember, again, I'm not a foreign policy expert. I've traveled the world in business, but I haven't got involved in diplomacy, so you're just learning these things. So you start learning about Ukraine. You have the Revolution of Dignity in February. I remember John McCain doing a Codell to speak at the Maidan. And Senator Murphy was the chairman of the committee. So he pretty well forced himself on that Codell, and he spoke at the Maidan. I didn't go. Quite honestly, I'm glad I didn't. Because now, as you unravel the history of that, and you realize that Victoria Nuland was just so proud of spending $5 billion to help foment that revolution that, as a ranking member or as chairman of the committee, you're getting played by the State Department. They don't talk about all the internal divisions of the ultra-nationalists, about the neo-Nazis, of the stark division within Ukraine before Russia invaded the east in Crimea, that those regions probably wanted to be ruled by Russia. They don't tell you about those things. Look at the result. $5 billion spent to depose a not perfect democratic elections. I don't think ours are either. But depose somebody that obviously was friendly to Putin. Putin didn't have a problem there. Putin wasn't taking over Crimea or eastern Ukraine. There wasn't war being waged between Russia and Ukraine. But once deposed, even though Russia was pretty well guaranteed, assured by James Baker that we were going to move NATO 1 inch to the east. Didn't exactly say that, but that was certainly the implication. And now we've moved it hundreds of miles. Now we're threatening to make Ukraine part of NATO. I mean, that's poking a stick in the eye of the bear a little bit too much. And you have to look at the result. I'm concerned about the Ukrainian people. If you're concerned about the Ukrainian people, you ought to be concerned about us using them now as cannon fodder in a proxy war between the West and Russia. I've been saying now for well over a year, Vladimir Putin will not lose in Ukraine. He will not lose. He's got 4 times the population. They can produce 4.5 times the 155 millimeter shells. They produce them at 1/10 of the cost, which is another subject about how we're getting ripped off by the military-industrial complex. And again, the result of this fomented revolution of dignity, this freedom flourishing in Ukraine, we've destroyed Ukraine. It's destroyed. And we're not willing to come to terms with that. We're sending another $60 billion, and there will be another $60 billion or more. Because unlike Chuck Schumer, when he comes out and lies, he comes out of the White House and said, this is simple. Ukraine gets $60 billion, they win. They don't get it, they lose. Immediately, as soon as they got the $60 billion, you had the Biden administration going, well, we don't think that's going to be enough. And obviously, there was no strategy to win, because you cannot supply Ukraine with the weaponry to win the war without literally risking World War III. So they'll never give them that weaponry. Not from the start. We knew that. We should have known that. So again, I'm coming off pretty harsh in terms of my evaluation of what I've learned in terms of American foreign policy that's been led by leaders that I'm not a fan of, okay? And you take a look at what the Obama administration, the Biden administration did in terms of funding Iran, the largest state sponsor of terror. Well, that's why Hamas was emboldened, strong enough, Hezbollah, the Houthis. I mean, that was a direct result of stupid foreign policy decisions by an administration. Now, I don't know how much time do I have left, because I want to be respectful of it. About 5 minutes. I think in my lifetime, of all the presidents I've lived under, the one president I think that was most unlikely to get us into a war was Donald Trump. And the left is just screaming about this guy's so dangerous. And I always use one example. And to me, this is exactly how an American president ought to think and how he ought to lead. Remember when I ran down that drone? And man, you could just hear the drums of war being beaten, right? We gotta retaliate. We gotta show them we're serious, you know? And so we were probably at the 12th hour, ready to strike and retaliate for Iran downing a drone. And President Trump, in that 12th hour, asked the relevant question, or questions. How much did that drone cost? What, a couple $1 million? How many Iranians are going to lose their lives over a $2 million drone? I've heard different numbers, but it was in the hundreds. And President Trump made the right decision by saying, I don't think a couple $1 million drone is worth those lives. So you want to understand my viewpoint? I am unbelievably anti-war. I'm glad I've never yet voted for an authorization for use of military force. I voted not to rescind them because we've had the finest among us in the field in danger. And I want to make sure the United States president had the power and the authority to protect them. But when the Obama administration came and looking for an authorization of military force in Syria and had no plan whatsoever, I remember John Kerry and the generals coming before Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I'm just asking them, they didn't have a clue. There was no way I was going to vote to authorize that group of Keystone cops. That's what we have right now for running our foreign policy. Obama's Secretary of Defense was right about Joe Biden. He's been wrong on every major foreign policy issue for the last 40 years. His string remains unbroken. But no, I think the first responsibility of an American president is to defend our nation, our homeland, and do everything he or she can do to keep us out of war. And again, where it's in our national interest, where we have the capability of providing security, we should. Again, we are the good guys. We want to see people around the world prosper. We want to see people live in peace and safety and security. And I think the best way we can lead, utilize our prosperity, utilize our superpower status, is not sending warships, not plussing up our military budget, but understanding what really made this country great, which is what I always say is the one essential ingredient: freedom. It's what has allowed all of our forebears. It's what allows us. It's what will allow our children, grandchildren, if we don't destroy this country beforehand, to dream and aspire and build and create this marvel of a country. We want that for the rest of the world. So let's use that example. Let's promote those principles. I think we would do a far better job at influencing the world in a positive way. I mean, look at how China does it. I mean, China is not a particularly warlike nation. Now, I'm highly concerned about how much they're spending militarily. I don't know how much of that is a reaction to what we do. But from a standpoint of dollars well spent, I mean, their Belt and Road Initiative, I mean, that's brilliant. You know, we can't afford to do it because we're spending close to $900 billion getting ripped off by the military-industrial complex. I'll end on this note because I brought that up. Walter Isaacson wrote a great book on Elon Musk. Interesting character. But one thing I really liked about that book is Elon Musk has something he calls an idiot index. And it's, you take a look at a manufactured product and you go, okay, what's the cost of raw material? How much do I have to pay for that? Divide those two and that gives you an idiot index. My guess is what we pay for things through our military industrial complex, the idiot index is off the charts. And we can't afford that. We can't afford that. But we also can't afford to be a warlike nation, engaging in endless wars, trying to project military power, when what we should be projecting is the goodness of the American people and the principles that made this country great. With that, again, thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Senator Johnson. We're going to go now to the great Dr. Jon Askonas. Jon is an assistant professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, but don't worry, he is not a Catholic. You are safe in here. He works on the connections between the Republican tradition, technology, and national security. He is currently working on 2 books: A Muse of Fire, Why the U.S. Military Forgets What It Learns in War, on what happens to wartime innovations when the war is over, and The Shot in the Dark, A History of the U.S. Army Asymmetric Warfare Group, the first comprehensive overview of a unit that helped the Army adapt to the post-9/11 era of counterinsurgency and global power competition. Everyone, please give it up for Dr. Jon Askonas.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Senator Johnson, for your remarks. I was thinking about when Nick proposed the subject. You know, what's the most kind of interesting or important thing to say? And I think the question underlying the discussion today, the thing I want to address is: does our Christian faith say anything to American foreign policymakers, American policymakers, about how America ought to conduct her foreign policy, or I should say her statesmanship? Foreign policy is not a word you'll find in the Constitution, right? You'll find war, you'll find diplomacy, you'll find commerce. You won't find foreign policy. Nobody talked about foreign policy until the rise of a kind of administrative technocratic apparatus of foreign policy making that said that, oh no, this is an area for experts. And the American people and her elected representatives don't have the expertise required to manage our foreign policy. And so I think we need to move away from that kind of language, return to thinking about statesmanship, return the American people and return Congress to their appropriate role in thinking about America's intercourse with other nations. But if you survey the history of Christians have always had to deal with this question, right? Christians have, at least since the 4th century or so, as you have the first sort of distinctively Christian polities, you face the question of, well, what does our faith say about our foreign policy, right? What does it mean to be a king and have an army and also worship Jesus Christ, who said that those who live by the sword will die by the sword, who said we must love our enemies? And so there's this very deep Christian tradition of thinking about this question. I think there are 2 ways that Christians have gone off both historically and in America, have gone off the rails in thinking about how a Christian state ought to relate to its neighbors. The first is attempting to bring heaven down to earth, and attempting to instill this sort of Christian, the notion of the kind of peace, the peace passes all understanding, the kind of peace that can exist among and within the church, and that we ought to pursue in our personal lives and pursue in our churches and communities, and try to instill that between states, right? So this is where you get Christian pacifism, right? And an attempt to instill in the polity this interpretation of the tenets of Christian religion. Christian pacifism has never really been pursued wholeheartedly as a theory of statecraft because it fails in the first instance, right? Evil is real, evil exists in the world, and a pacifist state would not remain independent and free and sovereign for very long, right? There's another Christians have also fallen off the other side of the wagon, which is to try to baptize practices of statecraft in the language of Christianity, right? To simply baptize, either to say that what goes on between states is not affected by the moral law, so kind of realpolitik approach, or to baptize whatever crusade or whatever war the king wants to initiate with some kind of justification, a raison d'etat. And this is also wrong, right? This also results in our Christian faith does actually say something about how we ought to conduct foreign affairs. And so the actual Christian tradition, the tradition of the best Christian thinkers like Augustine, thinkers like Aquinas, and then this tradition of international law that I'm going to talk about, finds the middle ground, which says that actually, on the one hand, we can distinguish between, in Latin, hostis and inimicus, so between the private enemy and a public enemy. So interpersonally, loving your neighbor probably does look like something like sacrificial peacemaking. As a matter of public order, to do justice towards evil is to resist evil. And the role of the state is to resist evil not only within the state in establishing public order and peace in the state, but even with regard to its neighbors, right? On the other hand, diplomacy, war are activities and therefore are morally fraught, just like any other sort of set of human activities is. And so things like a preference for peace is a very Christian idea. A preference for norms of just treatment and humanitarian treatment in warfare. Even down to things like, almost everything we think of as part of human rights, as part of international law, has a specifically Christian origin. Even down to things like the presumptive treatment of non-combatants or of wounded combatants, right? Like, the first military orders are like, we get the word hospital from the hospital orders of the Crusades, right? And so all of these elements of people who thought over the centuries about how our faith should infuse our actions in wartime are part of this tradition. And that's a tradition that is a very home in America as well, right? So George Washington wasn't much of a reader, but one of the books that he had in his possession was Vattel's work on international law and this great tradition of Protestant natural law thinking about how states should relate to each other, right? And the thinking of the founders about learning from, by their understanding, the conflict in the coercive power underlying European statecraft and seeking a different kind of international relations in the New World was deeply shaped by this tradition, right? And so from the founding up until the 20th century, the two primary agents of U.S. statecraft was not the Army. The Army had no foreign presence. The Navy was relatively small. We had a very small corps of diplomats and a handful of important foreign capitals. The vast majority of people representing the interests of the United States abroad and bringing back knowledge and intercourse to the United States were merchants and missionaries, And merchants and missionaries were the backbone of American intercourse with our neighbors, in huge distinction to the European pattern of warfare, up into and through the 20th century. Now, for reasons that Senator Johnson alluded to, America probably did need to take on a bigger role in the world, if only in defense of her own just interests in the 20th century. And yet I think that the exigencies of being a global superpower have led to a situation where many Christians justify extraordinary extraterritorial violence, oftentimes using a kind of simulacrum of the language of just war theory, without any real basis in the Christian tradition or the American tradition. I think, as you alluded to in your story about President Trump, even something as simple as the presumption against violence, the presumption that to start a war is to flirt with the libido dominandi, the sort of desire for domination and all of the horrors that war unleashes, the preference for and the protection of the rights of Christians abroad and the rights of missionaries. These are all deeply traditional parts of Christian statecraft, of American statecraft. And since especially the end of the Cold War, we've had an increasingly interventionist foreign policy that's been sold to American Christians, and it's completely out of line with our historical traditions. But thankfully, there are organizations like American Moment that are not only pushing back on the foreign policy side in practical political terms, but are also working to recover deeper thinking about the American tradition of statecraft. So rather than drone on, I think we'll turn it over to our next speaker, and then we'll maybe have extra time for questions later. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And now I'm going to turn it over to the great pastor, Jared Longshore, all the way from Moscow, Idaho. Everyone give it up for Pastor Longshore.
Good evening, everyone. Very glad to be with you tonight. As Nick said, I am a pastor from Moscow, Idaho. Just by show of hands, have you heard of Moscow, Idaho? Anybody? Nice. By show of hands, I always do this in class. By show of hands, raise your hand if you didn't raise your hand. No, like, sure, some of you didn't raise your hand. I'm very bad at observing people that don't raise their hands. So I need like raised hands and then not raised hands is usually where I go. But it looked like maybe 75% of the room knows about Moscow. It's up in the northern part of Idaho, which by definition means I am very much outside the Beltway. And yet here I am, married to my wife Heather. I have 7 children. I've been a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ for many years, 18 years or so. I'm also the dean at New St. Andrews College, a liberal arts and humanities college there in Moscow. And delighted to talk to you tonight, where we've had the senator talk about policy, John talking about international affairs. I'm coming more probably a doctrinal angle on just war, which is fitting because, of course, this is the theology of American statecraft. Who knew that went together, theology and statecraft? But it indeed does go together. And I think we're at a particular moment where it's opportunity for us to recognize just how much we need theology in our statecraft. Okay, but everybody likes a little, I've noticed, one nation under God, he's all over our buildings and whatnot, he's on our money and whatnot, but we don't really like to define him very much in our, at least what we've become as a nation, and I think we need to get back to actually defining him, and I think there's a great opportunity to do so. A couple anecdotes about what's happening in our society. I don't know, Tucker fans? Tucker fans? Okay, everybody loves Tucker, and I'm from Florida my whole life, and so Tucker's got he's got Boca Boy vibes. We call it Boca Boy, just a way. Let's do some golfing and some fishing and whatnot and speak plainly to one another. But right before he left Fox, he did this amazing rant somewhere, and I don't remember where he was, but you might remember this, and it was just the best thing I've seen. He was basically saying, when I got in the game, you understand, we used to have policy decisions. We used to be able to debate a little bit. Do you want to go that way? Do you want to go this way? He's like, but something different is happening. Everybody nods their heads. He's like, we're talking about mutilating children. Like, what? I think something spiritual's going on. He's like, I think we need to stop every day for 5 minutes and pray. Everybody's like, yeah. And he's like, look, I'm an Episcopalian. I'm like the worst Christian denomination that there is. No offense to the Episcopalians. I didn't say it. Tucker said it. We all love Tucker. What's he talking about? He's saying, no, you actually are seeing the manifestation of a particular ideology that is contrary to our nation's founding. 50 of the 55 men at the Constitutional Convention were Orthodox Christians. The Treaty of Paris, of course, acknowledged in the name of the Holy and Undivided Trinity. We used to talk about the indivisibility of the triune God and the way that we comported ourselves as a nation. And the idea that we're going to somehow be able to wage just war without acknowledging this God, and more particularly without worshiping him, as Augustine would say, without participating in him. It's not merely a matter of considering the data that he has left us embedded in this world as if we could somehow in a deistic fashion contract that data to whatever end we have in mind without participating with him, without actually knowing the one in whose image we are made. You see, that's the fundamental problem that we're experiencing as a society, and so we really do have to go a long way back. So Tucker's a great example of this. Jordan Peterson's a wonderful example of this. I think he was on Joe Rogan. He's like, the Bible, you got to understand, Joe, the Bible is the precondition to the manifestation of truth. You're like, wow. He's really thinking about the nature of truth and justice, etc. What's this have to do with just war? Well, the secular humanist approach is absolutely dead. Secularism is inept. It's an insufficient foundation for any society and for any theory of just war. Let's take the positivist secular idea. Here's nation A, here's nation B. The only law, the only standard that exists is the one that we posit ourselves. It's the one that humans establish. So in nation A, here's the nations that we will abide by. You're going to drive on the right side of the road. And here's nation B, we're going to drive on the left side of the road. Not to bring back any of our troubles with Britain by this example. But, well, now when you're going to talk about those nations interacting with one another, do you have a standard by which you can determine if their interactions are just? Not if you're a secularist. No way. There is no standard. Because the only standards the only standards in existence are the standards that nation A has established and the standards that nation B have established, and they've only established them for their particular nations. And so, by what standard are you going to determine the righteousness of some kind of engagement? You're not. Okay, that's the secularist problem. So you are simply not able to even answer the question about a just war without the Christian tradition, without the triune God. And the triune God has spoken to us. He has actually given us principles of just war. I'm going to walk through those principles, and then I kind of want to take a turn and show you the problem we're going to have with the principles if we don't make, say, certain changes. Okay? But let's talk about the principles themselves first. What are the principles of just war? There's a book by Eric Patterson, A Basic Guide to Just War Tradition. It's very good. There's 3 categories of just war. So categories and then principles. Categories, justice getting into war, should you go and have that fight. Justice in war. Once you're in a fight, what do? No punching below the belt, those kind of rules. And justice in ending war, which is often neglected. But, hey, who's going to pay for the building we just blew up? And what are you going to do with prosecuting war crimes and whatnot? Within each of these 3 categories, there's principles. Jus ad bellum, the morality of going to war. Legitimate authority. Okay, so Uncle Bob the plumber can't declare war on North Korea. You say, you don't know my Uncle Bob. Okay, maybe not, but Uncle Bob cannot declare war on North Korea and meet the standard of legitimate authority in just war thinking. Just cause, self-defense of citizens' lives, livelihoods. I always like to say this one. You ought to understand I grew up in Florida my entire life, only for the last 2.5 years, so I might get in trouble for saying this in D.C., but there's a great story about the war between the states. There was a river, and the Northern Army was on one side, Southern Army on the other side, and they weren't at war, but they were just washing up, big river. They yell across from the north, they say, "Hey, Johnny Reb, why do you fight?" He said, "Because y'all down here." Because y'all down here. Okay. Defense of our citizens' lives, defense of our way of life. I am in no way making any claim about the Civil War, so don't get too worried about it. But there you go. What are you going to do when they invade? Senator said this before. Well, we've got to fight. Right? Pearl Harbor, what are you going to do? Are you really going to say that we don't have just cause to get in this particular war? Just cause, second principle. Third, right intention. You actually have to have the right intention when you get into the fight. You say, well, that doesn't sound, how do you measure that? You mean the state of my heart and my orientation matters when I actually go to war? Yes, it absolutely does, according to the Christian standards. Likelihood of success, okay? Can you actually win that particular fight? Proportionality of ends. Does the preferred outcome justify in terms of the cost of lives and material? Of course, as the senator mentioned, should we have sent that $60 billion? I'd say no, we should have not sent that $60 billion. Why? Well, because of this particular proportionality of ends. Is it really going to be worth all of the lives? And we could get into that more. Last resort, have all the traditional diplomatic efforts been reasonably made? Once you're in war, 3 principles. Military necessity. That means basically once you get into a fight, you need to end that fight, and you need to end it swiftly according to all the standards of justice. So don't drag it out because you happen to be making a lot of money because you are in this particular fight. You need to end it. Second is proportionality. Basically, you're not allowed to take out 3 men on a hill with an atom bomb once you're actually in the fight. Your weapons need to be proportional. Discrimination. Don't shoot the non-combatants. Okay? Third category of just war thinking, use post-bellum. What do you have there? Order, a legitimate authority, has the capacity to provide basic government services for that particular jurisdiction. So we should be asking the question, can Zelensky really govern Crimea if he takes it back? Can he really? Does he have the resources at his disposal? And as the senator said, well, yeah, because we'll send him another $60 billion. But that's a different question. Can you really actually provide the services necessary on the back end of this thing? Justice, and that's how are we going to actually prosecute war crimes and whatnot. Restitution principles. And then conciliation, which I say is the equivalent of buying the other guy a beer when you're done. So some kind of treaty, some kind of public acknowledgement of the state of affairs and how we're going to move forward. There's a quick snapshot of the principles of just war. Now, here's the kicker. If you are honest with yourself, you cannot determine whether the war in the back seat, that fast food fight with McDonald's between the kids in the minivan, is just or not. You found that you actually can't figure out, was that a proportional response because he threw 3 French fries at me and I threw my milkshake back at him? And there you are, dad or mom in the car saying, was there a legitimate authority that declared this particular fight? Right? Why is that? Why do you, if you can't, as the great prophet Jeremiah once said in Scripture, if you have run with toddlers and they have wearied you, how can you contend with NATO? Really? No, let's be honest for a moment. You think here, I mean, with all due respect to our civil authorities, with all due respect to this very fine, wonderful city, do you really think that if you're having trouble raising the children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, there's a principle in the Bible, that if you can't raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, you have no business being an elder in a church. You have no business being a minister. And does the same not hold true for our civil dealings? If you can't adjudicate the food fight in the back of the minivan, how in the world are you going to be able to deal with justice concerning the advancement of NATO across Europe? So, what's my main point? Where do those just principles come from? Now, in Proverbs, wisdom is personified. Wisdom is speaking. Wisdom says, by me, kings reign. By me, kings reign. Which sounds lovely. Say, okay, what we want is wise, judicious, civil authorities. But the trick is, if you read on in that particular passage, this personification of wisdom continues to speak. And he says, I was with God in the beginning before the earth was founded. And say, oh boy. So if you want this wisdom, where do you have to go? Well, you have to go to the one who was with the Father in the beginning, creating the world. Okay, there is no bucket of wisdom in the world by which you can ascertain just principles of engagement apart from the one who is wisdom. And this is classic Augustinian thought. If we want to go super deep, it's very interesting and very confusing. But Augustine had this very interesting concept, what he called the ratione seminalis, which everybody falls asleep. What's that? It's the seeds of reason. He says when God created the world, he actually put these seeds of reason. He basically put a grain to the world. He actually did that. He did deposit that in the world. And so I believe this is like the foundations of what we're going to call the natural law. Thomas Aquinas later, very, very crystal clear in his Summa, talks about 4 categories of law. There's eternal law, which let's say God himself. There is natural law, and there is divine law, which would be the Bible, and there's human law. And he is unequivocally says human law must be established upon and ordered by a higher law. What law? Namely the natural law and the divine law. That means the Bible law. If you are not paying attention to that Bible law, and if you're not paying attention to that natural law, then you're simply not going to establish justice. We are not positivists. We don't believe that you as a civil authority can just declare whatever it is you want to do and think that it's going to be just or right. And the same holds for our international affairs. Just by what particular standard? So this Augustine said, yes, there are these seeds of reason, but this is where he's crystal clear. They are mapped off of and informed by what he calls the eternal reasons, which is basically God himself. And he has this theology of participation, that if you are not participating with this God, if you're not reconciled to this God, then you're not going to get the wisdom. You're simply not going to get it. Okay, so if you're familiar with Thomas, I'm sure in this company, you'd be very familiar with Thomas Jefferson, Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be what? That's not what Jefferson said, though. This is an educated crowd. You would know this. We hold these truths to be sacred. And what was the other one? Sacred and undeniable. Jefferson. And then I've heard at least that Franklin was suffering from gout. Okay. Jefferson walks it over to him, throws it down. Take a look. Let me know what you think, Ben. Ben says, hey, this part smells of the pulpit. Get rid of that. Sacred and undeniable. You're out. What's in? Self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We must send $60 billion to Zelensky. Isn't it self-evident? Now, I've opened up a can of worms and a lot needs to be said. I have no problem with things being self-evident to right-thinking people. But Romans 1, the Apostle Paul says, people are given over to a debased mind to do what not to be done. And then they do things that are contrary to nature. They do things that are contrary to that which is self-evident. What do you do then? Well, you die. That's what you do. Your society falls apart unless you're revived, unless you're reconciled to the one who has actually given you the mind that you have, unless you're reconciled to wisdom, the one who was with the Father in the beginning, creating the world, and the one in whom are found all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, and of course, righteousness and justice, etc., etc. You will not. Augustine was crystal clear. He actually talked about Cicero. Cicero said that a nation, let's talk about what a commonwealth is. He says a commonwealth is a people that are gathered together with a common sense of right. You know what Augustine said? He wouldn't be polite company here. He'd get in trouble, probably like I'm going to get in trouble. Augustine said, by that standard, Rome wasn't a commonwealth. You worship demons. What kind of justice is that? You think you're going to get justice from worshiping demons and idols? The only way you get justice is by the triune God, by worshiping him, acknowledging him. Then you can get justice. Otherwise, you simply can't access it. You can't get it. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with saying that things are self-evident, but to say that they're sacred, doesn't that speak something different to you? Doesn't it have this concept that there is divinity who has actually told us how we are to operate here, and we somehow must be reconciled to that divinity if we're going to even know what justice is? Okay, so I have no problem with you acknowledging the principles. That's good. We need the principles. But you'll manipulate these principles. You know you will. We've manipulated it because we've been in the backseat. We've been the one in the food fight with our brother because he took some of our French fries. And we know we'll do the exact same thing right here in the halls of Congress. We'll do that same kind of thing. So here's my main contention. We want a just war thingamajig, right? We can put in all of the relevant data on one side. It runs a mathematical equation, and it pops out an answer on the other side. Yes, support Ukraine. Yes, stand with Israel. We want a just war thingamajig, and you know why? Because it's far easier to do that than it is to repent. and to actually be reconciled to the God who is justice, the God who is righteousness. It's harder to do that. So we say, God, we would like to keep our lusts, but we'd also like to comport ourselves justly on the battlefield. And it never works that way. So if you want a nice metaphor for America, we are the prodigal son, say, 10 months into his bender, when he's still got some money in the bank, but the pig's husks are starting to look really good. That's where we are. And because we have that money in the bank, we're okay. We'll keep moseying along. And what we must do is genuinely repent. I looked it up. It was very interesting. You say this a historic Christian nation. That is what we are. Supreme Court has actually ruled so in a marvelously entitled Supreme Court opinion called the United States versus the Holy Trinity, which is not the kind of name that you want on top of the court. But the Supreme Court actually ruled. This is a particular Christian nation. And so what we must do is actually be reconciled to that God through his son, Jesus Christ. There's simply no other way to comport ourselves justly in our dealings in this nation, and there's no way to comport ourselves justly in our international affairs. So I looked up our Congress. I think it's like 85% Christian. It's all there. It's all quite public. Vast majority Protestant. There it is. And what we need to do is what Tucker said. Tucker got it right. When we stop, pray. And for a very active, practical people, I'm a very practical person myself, I commend to you the practicality of worshiping the triune God on Sunday. The practicality of it. The actual intercession, going before the Lord and saying, Lord, can you give me this kind of wisdom? Okay, so you can call it pedantic if you want, and you can call it silly if you want, but I love the story of King David. I have no idea how long I've gone, Nick, so pardon me. We'll go Q&A. This is my last. I'll close with this. What did King Saul do in the Bible? King Saul was constantly, he was tall, he was handsome, he was the right guy, he was hiding among the baggage, he was scared to death. He did not inquire of the Lord, but he was always trying to be shrewd and make good decisions, and he destroyed himself. Okay? That's that great thing where he tells all the necromancers to leave, he bans them, and then he goes and tries to find a necromancer to bring Samuel up from the grave. It's just a wonderful story. He's scared to death. What does David do? Well, there's some kind of threat to the Commonwealth, and David says, God, should I fight? God says, yes, go up, you'll win. And he does. Another threat to the Commonwealth. God, should I fight? No, don't fight this one. He doesn't. It turns out well for him. God, should I go up and fight? Actually, one time he says, well, do it in a minute, but hide in the bushes for a moment, and when you hear them marching atop the balsam trees, then go forth to war, which he does, and he wins. Sacred, divine, a standard that is outside of the world by which we are to comport ourselves in this life. And that standard ultimately is the Lord Jesus Christ, and we must call him Lord. In a nutshell, you will have Christ as the Lord of war, or you will have Lord of the Flies. Thanks so much.
All right, so we're going to go now to our short Q&A session. So be thinking of any questions you want to ask our now panelists. If I could get you guys to come sit here behind me, Hugh, if you would like to help me move this podium, that would be great. All right, so if anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand. Before we start, I'm going to beg of you, please, short question, phrase it in the form of a question. If you start monologuing, I'm going to take it away from you. So who would like to start? All right.
Senator Johnson, it's great to hear you reference the maritime freedom of navigation that has been part of our nation since the very beginning, since the foundation of the Navy. You spoke against, it sounded like strength and part of Iran, but you did mention the threat the Houthis pose to international shipping, something that makes sense for us to be involved in. And so I'm wondering, what is the appropriate response to Iranian proxies if we don't want to strike Iran itself for all these reasons?
Again, the appropriate response is not to coddle them, not to, through policy, funnel hundreds of billions of dollars into the largest state-sponsored terror so they can actually fund the Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas. So again, we've made this massive mistake. Now what do we do with it? Iran is not easy to deal with. But I just remember when they were negotiating the Iranian agreement, there's no way that a nation would put up with all those sanctions if they weren't absolutely dedicated to becoming a nuclear power. They could have just made it so easy on themselves by going, hey, come on and inspect. We're not going to build a nuclear bomb. We'll actually get nuclear material for our reactors. You can fully inspect it. Ease off. So it's just a fantasy on the part of the Obama administration and the Biden administration that you could deal with Iran. Just not recognizing reality. That's a big problem in Washington, D.C., is the simple denial of reality. And that's what we're facing right now in Ukraine. Same thing. So again, like Schumer said, get $6 billion, we win. Now they lose. They have no capacity to win.
Right. Who's up next?
Senator, Pastor, Doctor, thank you for your time tonight. I'm curious as to how just war relates to dealing with allies, I guess, across the nation, or across the world, rather. Specifically, there's a lot of talk of Ukraine tonight. I'm curious as to how we view the difference in Ukraine and Israel, specifically right now. Is the difference that Israel is an ally and Ukraine isn't? Is it more on Israel's position in the Middle East and Ukraine's position in Europe? Is there something deeper? Is there some just war tenet that says we should deal with the conflict in Israel differently than we should view the conflict in Ukraine? I'm just curious as your thoughts.
Pastor wants to go first.
Yeah. I hate this talk. So I'll leave the particulars of policy probably to the senator, to John. But the one thing that's very clear is what constitutes a nation. You have to get this idea that there is a beginning to a nation and there is an end to a nation. They are not eternal, which is an attribute of deity. But to acknowledge their finitude is humbling, isn't it? Because you say, well, maybe that nation's done, right? Or maybe that nation is changing. Maybe the borders of that nation are actually changing. So you have to deal with what constitutes a nation, which I think is much easier to do in the Ukraine-Russia situation than it is in the Israel situation. The Israel is just way above my pay grade. Ukraine and Russia probably is too, but I'll give you my 2 cents. The idea is you see a lot of Russian-speaking people over there in the East. You see Russian culture over there in the East. You see a convoluted history and all kinds of twists going on there. So when it comes to purely our situation as an ally, that's a different question to which I can't speak. But when it comes to, let's find out what's really going on in Crimea. If I were asking questions here in DC, I would say, we need to know what's really going on. How do those people identify? Where do they associate? Because God establishes nations, but he establishes them through peoples. So where are the commonalities? And if those allegiances are really with Russia, then you're going to have to tell Zelensky to draw a line. And you're going to have to, this is what we're going to do. We cannot continue to fund this and be working against the grain of what's actually going on in these particular nations. So I think you see enough, there's at least enough evidence to cause me to raise an eyebrow as one who's way outside of the Beltway and say, you need to be actually saying, what's going on with these nations, and let's not waste our money trying to work against that and press it back. I think there's, like I mentioned, the question of not only conciliation at the end, but justice at the end. Like, what can Ukraine actually do? And are we not going to be pulled into that where we're funding all sorts of resources over which we're not really going to be able to control the outcome of how, say, Crimea would be governed in the end if Ukraine were to actually take it back. So I think that's one way to take the principles of just war and see that we're throwing money down the drain.
Yeah, and to be clear, just war theory is only one small subset of broader Christian tradition of thinking about international relations. But one element of that is the question of legitimacy. So that Christian understanding of natural law says that not every state is legitimate, but legitimacy doesn't depend on being another Christian state, or it's a simple adherence to a minimal standard of the natural laws. A state that is truly predating on its neighbors or its own people in a depraved way is not a legitimate state, and the just thing to do is to depose that leadership. That's a very high bar, right? One thing I didn't get to say was, Eric Peterson, the German theologian, once said that every heresy has a political dimension, and historically this is absolutely true. You look at a heresy and it generates a kind of bizarre political outgrowth. You look at American foreign policy, what I see for the last 20 or 30 years is Pelagianism, right? We have a foreign policy that doesn't believe in original sin, right? And combines that element of realpolitik with the desire to bring heaven on earth, except not bounded to realizing the kingdom of God, but a notion of sort of liberal democracy as the end of history, right? You get to see two things together, and you have a worship of one form of government, which is established on a Christian basis in the United States, which is not necessarily the pattern of governance for every country in the world. So even before you get to these questions of prudence and 60 billion or whatever, you have to ask what business the United States have determining the internal political structure of Ukraine is not only a matter of our foreign policy, but we ought to actively invest in overthrowing another state's, or destabilizing at minimum another state's regime or another state's public order. Right? We've been way too cavalier about doing that. And during the Cold War, there was a justification in the fight against communism. But since the Cold, we've all those institutions we built in the Cold War have kept on chugging, even though the geopolitical and frankly moral circumstances have totally changed.
It's good to have a question. All three of you to chime in. Now, I would start, because I think it's just true in Ukraine. What starts out as a just war can devolve into an unjust war. And I think that's exactly what's happened in Ukraine. And I think we could prevent it. Policy mistakes, but once Vladimir Putin invaded, he didn't have to, but he did. That was just war. But as it has devolved now, let me tell you some of the depraved justifications that we've heard just over the $60 billion. Hey, this isn't really money going to Ukraine. This is money going to your state to create jobs. Or the goal of the conflict now isn't to restore the land and maintain freedom for Ukrainians. Let's degrade the Russian military capability, which we're not doing, by the way. We're building it up. Increase the price of oil, they get more revenue, they're building up their military industrial base, they're strengthening their alliances with Iran and China and North Korea. So the war aims are not being accomplished. The exact opposite thing is occurring. Quick question, specific answer on what I do with Israel. I would have armed them with bunker-busting bombs and the refueling tankers years ago. Say, hey, Iran, these people will act because you're an existential threat to Israel. You keep talking about it, so you better be put on notice. Again, you're trying to prevent war by very visibly providing a deterrent. But I would say the war in Israel now is entirely justified. And they have been, how long have they endured missiles being fired at their cities? How long have they endured trying to develop peace with a group of people who just won't even acknowledge their existence? I would say the other, in terms of what the pastor was saying, Israel can win, Ukraine can't. So right there, one of those principles of in the war, it's like, okay, now you got to just thinking. So what was a just war in Ukraine, I say no longer is. Israel remains a very just war. They have to destroy Hamas.
Thanks. I found the concept of justice very interesting. I'm going to try and make my question a little broader than that. But we talked about going into war, being in war, after war, and then you have this sort of thorny question about what do you do when you're not at war? As we sort of are not at war right now, and we also are in a sense perpetually at war. We have been for a number of decades, but we're not in any kind of major conflict with a major power. So what would Christian theology have to say about that? How are we conducting our semi-peace right now? Thinking about defense expenditures, our force posture globally. Are we conducting a good peace? Should we call it peace? How do we think about all of that? Thank you.
Yeah, the trick is you have the question of just war between two nations, nation A, nation B. They're in a fight. Is there justice on the side of nation A or nation B and whatnot? And then you have nation C. even if it is a just war, should we get involved? That's really the place that the United States of America is at. And we're just remarkably, remarkably wealthy and remarkably powerful. The main point that I'd say when it comes to helping other nations is kind of like help when you can. Always be ready to help a neighbor, right? And there needs to be qualifications on that principle when you apply it to nations. But you can't overextend yourself. Now, and I don't mean that just strictly financially. I mean that what kind of man are you? Do you have the virtue necessary in order to help, in order to throw your weight behind the side of the good, and to help your neighboring nation? One, should they be helped? Okay, so you're going to have to ask several questions. What are their commitments? Are they committed to the same fundamental commitments that we are, such that we call them an ally, or are they not? Right? That's question number one. But second, even if they are, what can you really do? And regrettably, if you look at our nation, our divided nation, as the senator was saying, we have serious house cleaning to do before we should consider extending ourselves in other foreign conflicts. We need righteousness and justice at home and a genuine restoration before I would be recommending that we extend ourselves.
So just real quick, what I said earlier, you achieve peace through strength. Understand what strength is. I mean, we should be focusing on strengthening this country, unifying, growing our economy, and getting our house in order so that we help deter. And we are superpower. We can influence the world, but not if we're weak. If we're strong, we can, and in doing so, we can prevent war, and that ought to be the aim of our foreign policy. How do you prevent war?
I'll just add two quick things. I think, one of the downsides of divorcing foreign policy from statecraft is you miss the ways in which things are interconnected, right? And I think, as the senator alluded to earlier, it is a justice issue that we spend so much time and effort and money helping other countries when there are Americans, our neighbors, who could use those resources better, or to whom we have a duty, actually, a positive duty to use those resources. That's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is, prior to the 1990s, the United States military did not have force structure to be able to continually exert violence around the globe. It was something people, certain kinds of hawks complain about, right? Well, we've built that force structure now. And I do think that there is something morally degrading about the simple willingness to exercise a kind of steady drumbeat of mowing the lawn, as people say, in our use of violence abroad. And I think, frankly, it's one of the sources of growing conflict in the world. There was a great meme going on Twitter of Hamas rockets being launched at Israel being shot down with Iron Dome rockets. And it said, on one side, my tax dollars, and it said, somehow also my tax dollars. I think what we've seen in the last 20 years is this kind of micromanagerial approach to managing violence. And it's creating these feedback loops of more and more violence. And so I think the way to reduce violence is to stop killing.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming here tonight. Professor Askonas brought up an interesting point that American foreign policy used to be centered around protecting Christians abroad, Christian merchants, Christian missionaries. Some have made the argument in Ukraine that it's good that American money has gone to Ukraine so that European nations don't rearm. And it, in some sense, might preserve a longer peace in Europe if Europe remains demilitarized. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but I want to pose a question to you. In making calculus between how do we support our allies in Europe and how do we begin to build allies in Southeast Asia, do Americans need to make a calculation between Europe as a historically Christian continent to which we might have responsibilities as a fellow Christian nation, and other places such as Southeast Asia or Africa, which don't necessarily have Christian heritage? Does that heritage play into how we need to structure our foreign policy?
It's an interesting question. I think there's kind of two categories here. There's, I don't think there's anything wrong about. I often think about George Kennan, really underappreciated figure in American diplomacy, someone who understood that the root of foreign policy is actually spiritual conflict. Right? He says that in the long telegram. He says that throughout his long life. He's a lifelong Presbyterian, and I think we ought to have a foreign policy which is cognizant of our values, and our values are not liberal democracy. It's not human rights. It's a particular tradition of statecraft that comes from our Christian heritage. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with approaching friendship with other nations on that basis. That's how I would put it, I think. I think that's a little bit separate from the specific question of the treatment of the persecution of Christians and the persecution of missionaries, towards which, again, for over 1,000 years of Christian statecraft, Christian states have been willing to intervene, including militarily, to protect Christians from explicit persecution and from Christian missionaries from persecution. And I think that's something that, to be fair, the United States during the Cold War, with the banner of religious freedom, basically continued this tradition. I think it's something we need to really recover in our thinking.
So, a couple premises and a question. So one, my sense is that a lot of the reason that people got so ginned up about the Russian-Ukraine conflict is that what we saw with Russia was something close to an old-style conquest. They have their justification, but ultimately, they see the land, they think they can take it, and so they attempt to do so. At the same time, if you look back into America's history, specifically our Western expansion, that could, I think, also be categorized as a conquest, whether it's against the Native American tribes or through the Mexican-American War. So with that said, what do you folks see as sort of the legitimate role, if any, for conquest, for the taking of another political community's property, land, what have you, within the just war tradition, within Christian thought?
Well, so historically, how about this? As a part of the practicality of international law, Christian, just war thinking. Well, just war thinking was a moderating force on the practice of war, which has always included conquest, right? And so the goal was not, and I have to say, for something that was not enforced by any kind of central body, it was remarkably successful at pushing down. Conquest steadily diminished in European politics throughout the medieval period and into the early modern period. Conquest in the sense that you're talking about it. So I think that's an achievement. I think that given the scale of destruction caused by modern warfare, it's hard to justify. Most wars of conquest are actually not that violent in terms of the number of people that actually die. I think that the scale of modern warfare raises additional questions of justice. It's impossible not to have a massively destructive modern war. In addition, one wouldn't say the American West was empty, but it was pretty empty from a population density standpoint. I think there's a different question, going to questions of proportionality about kind of natural expansion due to demographic pressure and actually going to attempt to take a highly populated area. But that being said, it's also a moot point because since the end of the Second World War, almost every country in the world has signed the UN Charter. So that's a treaty that we've all agreed to, and the terms of it basically forbid wars of conquest. And I think that's probably a good thing, and frankly, that's in some ways a fulfillment of a centuries-long trajectory of Christian influence on international law.
Right. One last question. Anybody? I know you heard one. Oh, Hank. All right.
Thank you. So I have a question. We've kind of touched on this, a couple of you guys have touched on this, but the idea of moral obligation that a nation has to sort of intercede in a dispute. Right now, I would say probably all of the wars that we've been talking about, whether it's politicians or media outlets, they're pulling at people's heartstrings. They're saying this is a moral obligation to get involved, genocide, all that. So could you guys speak to whether nations have that same moral obligation that it seems like people are trying to pin an individual's moral obligation on a government and distinguishing between the two?
I think there's definitely discontinuity between an individual and a nation. You have to think about those civil authorities, legitimate authority, that just war principle. You need a legitimate authority to declare war. You need a legitimate authority to say we're going to throw our weight. We're morally obligated to enter into this conflict between nation A and nation B. And that civil authority needs to make that declaration and consider that moral obligation in relationship to the other moral obligations incumbent upon him. Okay? How is he executing justice in his own land? Because that is his primary responsibility. Okay? And if you want to get pretty wild, even in the old Westminster, so for the Presbyterians, the old Westminster Confession of Faith said that civil magistrate had certain duties and obligations to the Church of Jesus Christ, the Church of the living God. Even in the American version, the Presbyterians in America said that there was a duty incumbent upon civil magistrates to protect the church, and that would be the milder form. And so I would just posit that as one duty that a civil magistrate should be considering. How are you doing at that, would be my first question. How are you doing at executing justice in your particular society, right? Do you understand what justice is, and are you executing that justice? So I would not say, it's not my position that there's absolutely no moral obligation incumbent upon a nation to assist other nations that are suffering and experiencing tyranny. I don't think anybody wants to go all the way to say they have no moral obligation whatsoever, right? I mean, if Hitler's running his way, if Hitler's conquering the world, we're gonna step in. But it must be weighed in relationship to those primary central duties. Romans 13 in Scripture, what's the civil magistrate's duty? He's a minister of God to execute justice on the wrongdoer, and he has to do that first. If he's not doing that, he can't meet that other obligation.
I'd say it's also very relative. If you look, Clausewitz taught me is, war, politics is just war in a different part of the spectrum. And so kind of depending on how outrageous the moral harm is, you kind of calibrate, well, what's your response? And I think we did know about the Holocaust and we just covered it up for whatever reason. But if the world knows about the Holocaust, they get a moral obligation to go in there and use all necessary means to end it. Something short of that, well, what kind of diplomacy, what kind of sanctions? What can you do in terms of your diplomacy and your alliances to again isolate the wrongdoer? So again, it's all relative. How bad is the moral harm versus what type of warfare within that spectrum, from politics to outright bloody war. What can you employ?
The only thing I add to that is, I think a serious just war, understanding the humanitarian dimension of the Christian tradition, focuses on the humanitarian. Right? Our humanitarian interventions have a way of fulfilling certain goals of various factions in DC foreign policy, right? They're not actually humanitarian interventions. The best example of this is Libya, right? Where we have this authorization to supposedly protect against this genocide in Benghazi, and the way we do it is by destroying the military and helping our erstwhile allies topple the Gaddafi regime. Right? It's not actually a humanitarian intervention. So, if it comes to it as a matter of last resort, you should be looking at things like humanitarian corridors, refugee camps, like actually attempting to protect humans on the ground, as opposed to using this as a foreign public military objective by other means.
By the way, let me just quick add. One of the problems we have with giving the executive, the president, so much power when it comes to waging war, engaging in war, deciding that without congressional approval. First of all, I think Congress is just dodging its constitutional authority and responsibility to do that. But if we were doing it the way I think our founders contemplated this, where foreign attendance would be pretty rare and you need authorization from Congress, the relative moral harm and the relative response would be carried out in a more deliberate process with we the people being involved through your elected representatives versus kind of one guy making decisions for all of us, and that's problematic.
Can I get a round of applause for our fantastic speakers? Thank you all very much. That concludes the programming for this evening. So thank you all very much for coming and enjoying this time of fellowship together. We do have this room for another 30 minutes, so feel free to hang out, talk to one another about what you've just learned, argue, whatever it is you guys are going to do. I will say that, Pastor Longshore doesn't make it to DC very often. And he has graciously offered to hang out with a bunch of you. I believe we're going to be going to Shelley's back room to smoke some cigars. So if any of you would like to chat about this further, Jared Longshore, I'm not sure if he has an early flight tomorrow or not, but he's here to hang out. So we will go do that. So if you want to go to that, just stick around while we tidy up, and we will arrange some rides over there. Thank you very much, and please give another round of applause for our speakers.